NOCN vLearn launches to all NOCN Group centres for programmes, qualifications and bespoke accreditation. vLearn is a custom-branded, easy-to-use virtual learning environment to empower your tutors and learners by utilising the most cutting-edge technology, including a learning management system, digital content, artificial intelligence and chatbots. The following topics will be the first to launch: tutor support for qualifications and bespoke accreditation, assessment materials and mock examination content, hundreds of ready-to-go digital learning courses. vLearn provides all of the features you need in one place. All of this for only £20 per month per centre, learner fee for only £2 per learner per month. Contact your NOCN Group Account Manager at business-inquiries@nocn.org.uk to become a part of the vLearn experience. NOCN vLearn.
Good morning. Good morning. Fantastic to be joining you this morning for what is now week 6, the final episode in our ongoing webcast series for the FE White Paper. Delighted to have you joining us. We just used the first couple of minutes now to make sure that you can see me and hear me, and also that you can use the questions feature, which is obviously can be used not just for questions but for comments. So why not let me know if it's nice and bright and sunny with you where you are, as it is here in Southeast London. So you can just tap in there, give me a little wave, say hi. I'll give a few shout outs, but we have several hundred, just over 400 on the line so at the moment, so I won't be reading out everybody's name, but it'd be great to have a few of you say hi. Hi James, hi Campbell, hi Colin, hi Tracy. Morning Michelle, hi Peter. So where are you in the world? We've got Nottingham, Crewe, North London, Frinton-on-Sea, Fareham rather, Kent, Essex, Durham, York. Now and again, we used to have people that happen to be abroad and that would tune in on their holidays for certain things. But I've got a funny feeling you're all going to be a bit close to home. Bedfordshire, Cheshire. Oh, we've got a Cyprus here from Leslie. Fantastic. So it looks like all the technology is working nicely, and thank you for those of you that are still letting me know how sunny but cold it is. Yeah, it's pretty cold here too. Fantastic. So we are now in our what is likely to be our final webcast as advertised, week 6, and the running order shouldn't come as too much surprise. We've stuck to the format now for the last 5 weeks, and we are not about to change that in our final week. So first of all, you're going to hear from me. I'm going to do a little overview, as I have done the last few weeks, of the chapter in question, which is the last chapter, a chapter entitled Supporting Outstanding Teaching. Now this is a policy area that I'm certainly no expert in, so delighted to be joined by 2 experts. First we'll hear from our webcast partner, Graham Hastings Evans, who is of course the Chief Executive at NOCN Group, our friends over at NOCN who have partnered with us throughout this FE White Paper webcast series. And then our VVIP, our very, very important person, I have the pleasure of being joined with David Russell, Chief Executive at the Education Training Foundation, who'll be very familiar to many of you, and who better to hear from in the context of outstanding teaching and the government policies in that area than the Chief Executive of the Education Training Foundation, who of course are at the heart of many of those policy reforms. So really looking forward to having a conversation with David about the plans ambitious plans in this white paper. So that's the plan. As is always the case, or certainly has been for the last 5 of these webcasts, this is being recorded, and so the recording will be sent to you after this webcast, along with a copy of the slides if you wish to download, the ones that you're about to be presented by me. By all means, please do share that recording far and wide, and we also have a web page on FE Week where we add after each webcast a link to the recording and the slides. So there is one web page. We'll send you a link to that. So if you have missed any of the previous webcasts, any of the other chapters you're interested in, I might mention a few things from those over the coming few minutes. Please do watch those back, and again, feel free to send those around. The key reason, of course, for doing these webcasts is to try and really continue the conversation, keep the momentum up around the FE policy. We've now have the white paper, the long-awaited white paper, but there is still a lot more to be determined, many of these policies to be fleshed out, legislation to be passed, and so on. So I think everyone has agreed that the more the sector itself can engage in that policy process, the better it will be as an outcome for our institutions and learners. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to crack on. So just a couple of slides that I've been using to start with for each of these webcasts to start with, just to remind you of a few key things before we delve into the specifics of this particular chapter. So the first thing is I've just tried to use some numbers here. You know I like my numbers. So some numbers from the document itself, just to try and reinforce the point that this is a very wide-ranging white paper. This isn't the sort of white paper that has been produced to try and introduce one policy. Absolutely not. I think it probably serves 2 purposes, or one way of describing this white paper is to serve 2 purposes. One is to announce some plans around some new policies, some of which will take 3, 4, maybe 5 years to implement. Some of them will need, we think, will need new legislation that's being worked on at the moment, although nothing yet in the public domain in terms of that legislation, but should be shortly. So we've got new policies in there, which some of which we didn't know much about at all being announced. And the other purpose I think it serves is it's an opportunity for the government and the Department for Education to pull together all of the relevant reforms that have been going on, including some dating back 5 years, if you consider the apprenticeship reforms as an example of that. Pull all that together into a single, hopefully coherent document in terms of this white paper, and then get essentially across the government, get all the departments to sign off on this plan going forward. So very important document, and it's been, I think by my calculation, it's probably been close to 15 years since we've had a white paper for further education, and they serve some very important purposes, specifically around legislation, which I'll mention in a moment. So very wide-ranging is the kind of point, as I say, of that slide. Now this slide, the point of this slide, again, before we get into the detail of the final chapter in the white paper, the point of this slide is, from my perspective, is to highlight, I think, the main, not the only, but the main purpose of the white paper in terms of new reforms. And I think it's a thread which runs through every chapter, and you'll see when we look at the final chapter around outstanding teaching that it's a thread that runs through that as well. And it's about, for me, it's about the government's fresh or new approach or attempt to join up employer needs with, in that sense, their demands with the supply, if you want to do it as an economist, with the supply of education and training from the further education providers, and particularly, I would say, particularly from the college sector. If I was being, I don't know whether the government would publicly agree with me, but I think privately they would. This white paper is really very much about colleges, and it's about that part of the FE sector paying more credence to the economic needs, as they would describe them, in the form of local employers. So this is very much, you can see here, I've chosen what for me is a very important paragraph at the start of the white paper in the introduction from our Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson, in which he says that this white paper aims to, and I quote, strengthen links between employers and the further education providers, placing employers at the heart of defining the needs and exploring a new role for chambers of commerce and other business representative organisations working with local college and employers. And when you start to read through the small print, you realise this is a white paper so that they can introduce legislation such that if colleges, when working with the likes of chambers of commerce and other employer groups, when colleges do not run the courses that these local employers think they should be running, then the Secretary of State, in this case, Gavin Williamson, can, in their words, can intervene, can use the powers of intervention. Now, one of the problems with, they would argue, I think, with the current system is that the powers of intervention have not really been used directly yet, and it's quite difficult for them to be used when there's financial difficulties, because the local MPs, even the Conservative ones in the past, have always, of course, defended their local college, and then the government get blamed for the financial difficulties that the colleges have got in, regardless of the extent to which that's the reason for the difficulties. And it's been quite difficult for the government to take direct action, the way I read it. What it looks like, as far as this white paper is concerned, is that new legislation will enable them to take action, not specifically over finances, but to take action if, for example, colleges are doing too many courses that are perhaps in a sector that the local employer groups do not prioritize, do not see as a priority for the local economy. And you can see other parts of the sector have been calling for ways of ensuring these colleges change the courses to make them more relevant to the local economy. If you consider comments from, for example, the Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, she's criticised colleges publicly in the past for example, running too many courses in performing arts in areas where there are not local jobs in performing arts and so on. So quite a controversial area for all the obvious reasons. But this seems to be a new approach from government to use legislation. This is what you need to keep an eye on over the coming months. As we get a chance to see this legislation, it will get debated in Parliament, such that, as I say, if the new local skills improvement plans that the employers draw up, as we understand it, with colleges, or we'll see how that plays out, but once they have been signed off by government, then the job of the colleges is to follow that. And if they don't follow it, technically, the Secretary of State could intervene. Intervention could be in the form of essentially just not giving them more money in the future, which is a pretty strong form of intervention. But as I say, all to play for. And if you want to find out more about this particular theme around the new legislation and potential interventions where colleges don't follow the local plans, please do watch back our first webcast from week 1, where I was in conversation with Keith Smith from the Department for Education, who is the kind of main author, architect, at least as far as the words are concerned in this document. And I was quizzing him at length about what that legislation might look like going forward. So all to play for, many things to be determined in that space. But as I say, what you'll find as we look through chapter 5, the remaining chapter, is that there's a common thread, in fact, through all the chapters around meeting the needs of employers. And it's interesting, last week we were looking at governance, and we were talking to some governance experts, and they were saying that, which I found fascinating, the governance experts were saying it's going to be a real challenge for government for a lot of in a lot of areas around meeting needs for employers, where the employers' needs don't necessarily align to the learners' needs. And actually, who is the college or the independent training provider or similar, who are they actually there to serve in terms of their kind of charitable status and so on. So really interesting one to watch, but this is certainly the government's attempt at moving to a more Germanic system where the employers are much more engaged than they already have been in the further education skills sector. So as I say, we are now in week 6, which puts us in the final chapter, chapter 5, which I'm now going to focus on now before we hear from Graham and then David. And that chapter is called Supporting Outstanding Teaching. So that's what we'll be covering. today. As I say, all of these 5 chapters plus the first week, which was a sort of summary week, are all available to watch back, and we'll send you a link to that. So as with all of the chapters within the white paper, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have had an opportunity to have a look at the white paper itself. It's been out now for a couple of months. There are essentially sub-chapters, as it were, within that chapter. So here is a screenshot of the relevant sections or sub-chapters within chapter 5, all around policies to support the teaching workforce within the further education and skills sector, whether that be in terms of recruitment, retention, or their professional development when they are in the profession. So the first thing we'll just look at, we'll work through these chapters, but the first thing is I'll just put these on screen for you to have a quick read. This is some quotes in the kind of opening section before the first subchapter, and I just thought that these were quite interesting sentences and worth reflecting on. So first thing is that we've got in the white paper some kind of anecdotal evidence, particularly coming from, as it says here, principals. Again, you'll see this repeated throughout the white paper, where there's reference to the kind of colleges in particular, and this will be an ongoing challenge, no doubt. And we'll talk to David about this in terms of where the policies are directed just at colleges, or where they're available to the whole sector, and trying to work our way through eligibilities for individuals depending on which type of institution they happen to be at. But this seems to be a bit of anecdotal evidence that it's becoming difficult to recruit to the teaching profession within further education and skills colleges, and also to retain those that have been recruited. So it says that more than half say they find it recruitment difficult. And if you have a look at the white paper, that they provide various sources of college surveys and so on that this information has been taken from. So that's the kind of one of the problems, and we're looking at kind of innovative new solutions to that problem. Then we've got the issue of particular subjects where it's particularly difficult to recruit to. So there's a line here about, for example, engineering and construction, where there are vacancy rates. It says as high as 5%, although to me 5% vacancy rate doesn't sound huge, but that's what they are quoting as an issue, particularly in engineering and construction. And then it goes on to say we need more teaching staff with the necessary experience in the relevant industries to be able to deliver high quality teaching based on cutting edge skills and knowledge. We will also work to put a diverse workforce that reflects the diversity of those who study further education. And this is quite interesting, really flagging up in the introduction that, as it says here, only 6% of FE teachers and lecturers are from the BAME, have BAME backgrounds, and it says they will look to understand why this is the case and develop strategies to address this issue. So nothing new there. I'm not aware that the representation from the BAME community has reduced, but it's clearly significantly lower than the community that it serves. And as I've put in my own words, you'll see I did end the quote of the word, the paragraph before the last sentence. There doesn't appear to be, as we go through these chapters, to me anyway, there doesn't appear to be any mention of addressing what for many is a key issue as far as recruitment and retention is concerned, which are the levels of pay. So we will talk, I'm sure, a bit about that later. But as far as investment from government is concerned, as we walk through this, it seems to be around the marketing, around the training, around, in some cases, bursaries. But as far as the pay levels are concerned within further education skills, that seems to have been very much left to the individual institutions and not something that the government is, it would appear, is keen to get involved in. So let's start with the first subchapter. So the first subchapter is entitled An Ambitious Recruitment Strategy with a National Campaign and a One-Stop Information Platform. So what's this chapter saying? Saying there will be a national recruitment campaign. It's expected, which doesn't sound massively committal, but we shall see. It's expected to be launched this year, and they're hoping to reach millions of prospective teaching staff, which sounds like it could be expensive, depending on how they determine reach and millions. But the government have not been averse to spending significant sums on recruitment campaigns. I remember when they spent around 15 million on advertising apprenticeships about 8 or 9 years ago. They've spent 5 million on advertising T-levels. So I'm sure we would welcome more advertising how fantastic it is to work and study in further education. The better, the more high profile the sector can be made, the better. So this should be welcome, no doubt. But it's interesting that, as always with public money, and I'm sure quite rightly, it is looking to be fairly targeted. In this case, they want to target those millions of prospective teachers who have, quote, experience with and skills in industry, and who can train the next generation of technical experts. So very much expecting this campaign to target existing, so rather than targeting graduates, rather than targeting those that are looking to move into their first job, which could be in education, perhaps even those that have been doing their T-levels in that space. This is looking to target perhaps the older generation who already have experience and skills outside teaching. And there's been a fair bit of that that's been happening on a smaller scale to date. I'm sure David Russell from the ETF will talk a bit about that, but this is looking like something that's to be ramped up off the back of a new recruitment campaign. So let's find out a bit more about the plan here. Our recruitment campaign would direct potential teachers to the new Teaching FE platform. Alongside a dedicated telephone line, the platform will give potential applicants all they need to take the next step into teaching, with information on how to access relevant training, for example, the Taking Teaching Further program, and financial incentives such as training bursaries. So again, we do have money being put in here, not just into the marketing campaign. We have money being put into a helpline as well as a platform, as they call it. I suspect they mean a series of web pages on gov.uk with all of the information they deem to be, the government deemed to be relevant to support the potential applicant in taking their first step into being trained to become a teacher in our sector. And a reference here to some of the training bursaries, which have tended in the past to be fairly sector specific, so targeting those sectors where there are those gaps in recruitment. We will develop innovative schemes that give people teaching experience, such as the ETF's Talent to Teach program, which offers a great taster of FE teaching to university students and recent graduates. So I'm sure we'll pick that up with David shortly. Okay, what next? So then we have the initial teacher education. Essentially, this is, as I understand it, again, I'm not an expert in this space, and I do get a bit, I've always got a bit confused by all the different, maybe that's one of the issues. I've always got a bit confused with all the different qualifications that are out there and routes that are out there to get into teaching and what it means to be qualified. Well, the initial teacher education, ITE, is the formal route into the sector as far as teaching is concerned, and there does appear to be, according to the white paper, some concern around the quality of some of the courses in that space. So they say that they are keen to have Ofsted do more in this space. So let's read this. It's vital that FE providers are confident in the quality of initial teacher education. Ofsted has confirmed that its future inspections will now cover all publicly funded FE initial teacher education, not just those delivered by universities. So this is broadening Ofsted's remit beyond universities in a kind of topsy-turvy world. We've seen this, haven't we, with apprenticeships, where it's gone the other way, and they're broadening their remit to include universities. So Ofsted taking on more responsibility here for inspection, across non-university routes where you can study to become certificated as a teacher. It says this is an important first step in driving up quality and enabling potential staff and employers to identify the best training available. They're also looking at revising the actual content, the curriculum of this particular qualification, and I've put this in orange because this is an example of that kind of thread running through the white paper about bringing institutions together as far as employer demand is concerned, employer needs. So it says here there'll be a revised employer-led standard. I'm sure we're all familiar with that language and terminology when it comes to apprenticeships for further education teaching. And that's currently being developed by a group of sector employers, and they anticipate a clear benchmark for teaching quality, which will be set by September 2021. So what tends to happen in this sort of space is that my reading of this, I'm interested to chat as we will with David about, my reading of this is that there may well be a new minimum requirement to be a teacher lecturer in this space. As soon as September, well, I would anticipate if they're going to bring something in, it would be phased in. But this would certainly potentially significantly drive up enrollments to a particular course to be trained in being a teacher. If the benchmark is set high, then there will be possibly tens of thousands of current teachers in the FE and skills space who would need to be put through this course. Based on this new standard, we will support the redevelopment of FE initial teacher education qualifications so that they too are based on the same clear set of outcomes. So this could be very, very significant for the workforce. It could be, I mean, one way of looking at this is if it further professionalizes the workforce, that could put them in a very good space for higher pay levels where money is available. On the other hand, it could put potential applicants off, which could work against the recruitment strategy. And this is definitely something that's worth exploring, as I'm sure we'll do over the coming kind of 45 minutes or so. We'll consider introducing new statutory powers. So again, intervention powers, Secretary of State considering taking some more powers as part of this new bill. It's what tends to be what happens when you find the time in the parliamentary calendar to introduce legislation, is that you can put lots of things in there. And one of the things they're looking at including in there, if they're going to take the time to introduce legislation, is potential powers for Secretary of State to take an active role in regulating provision. So one assumes, my reading of that would be, for example, that maybe one of the powers could be if your staff are not qualified to a certain level, to that benchmark, then you don't get funding. That could be the sort of intervention that they might be thinking about. If you don't, you know, they're considering it because I guess they're saying if you ignore the government, like in the same way if colleges ignore the government as far as which courses that the government wants them to run, or the employers want them to run, if the colleges ignore the government in terms of their staff being qualified, maybe the independent training providers, not clear yet, of course, which courses this would apply to and so on. But clearly they're saying if your staff are not meeting this benchmark, this quality mark, then perhaps the government will intervene in some way. So next subchapter, just briefly, is entitled "A Seamless and Strong Relationship Between Education and Industry." So that thread doesn't get any stronger across colleges and employers in partnership than in this particular section. So this says we will enable providers to collaborate routinely with business to develop their teaching workforce through the two flagship programs, one being the Workforce Industry Exchange and the other being Taking Teaching Further. They're going to expand the existing program, Taking Teaching Further. That's due for significant expansion. I think that's running now at about 500 participants a year. They're going to try and expand it up to 2,000 participants a year, which enables industry experts to move into teaching more easily. We'll introduce a new workforce industry exchange program across a wide range of subjects and sectors. And then that takes us into, once they've been recruited, their ongoing professional development, particularly, I suspect, those staff that have perhaps been in the further education skills sector for a significant time. I was seeing something recently about somebody that I think been a teacher at college for close to 40 years, which is certainly going some. So it's about continuous professional development. So they're going to look at what more can be done to support the use of digital skills by teachers, well, the need for digital skills for the teachers and the lecturers to increasingly support what of course most learners have been doing, certainly for the last year and a bit, around their online and blended teaching, and that going forward. Continue the T-level professional development offer for another year. Expand the demonstrator program. Struggling a bit to keep up with all the different names of all these programs, apologies. That's what we've got David Russell coming up to help us with. That provides peer-to-peer support for thousands of schools and colleges, including ways they can support remote education. And then there is also a college collaboration fund they'll continue with to develop high quality resources for colleges to share in a coordinated way that is scalable. Apprenticeships. Now this is an interesting one. I've put all these up. The reason why this is particularly interesting to me is because the government is, of course, introducing a third attempt at the apprenticeship register of providers. And the thing to watch when we see the detail, we haven't actually seen the detail yet. And they say it's being launched or refreshed again for a third time, refreshed for a second time, but essentially launched for a third time this month. What we haven't seen is the detail yet as far as the staffing requirements to be on the register. And we could see that, again, the first use of that concept of a benchmark, where if you don't have, perhaps if your teachers aren't qualified in a certain way at a certain level, then you can't get on that register, or they need to maintain through professional development in some way their skills, and you could no longer be on that register if you don't maintain it. And we do have that type of arrangement in other areas. For example, my wife is a consultant hematologist, obviously in the NHS, and if she doesn't keep up with her CPD, logging that, getting a certain number of points every year and so on the NHS's system, then in theory she then could be taken through a form of disciplinary process and ultimately struck off. So it might be something that they are looking at carefully in other areas with regard to the further education skills sector. So this is quite an interesting one to watch around apprenticeships, even if you're not involved in apprenticeships, with this new register, and whether it will be used almost to kind of pilot a kind of minimum standard for the teachers and lecturers. And then the last section, it's literally one paragraph. It's nothing that we didn't know. I don't think. We've been talking for some time about about revisiting the data collection on workforce. This is something that, as I understand it, has been for quite a number of years been passed over to the ETF to be responsible for, but it's pretty patchy, and I've never really been a fan of using this data in terms of its reliability, and it's being revisited with a view to trying to better understand the workforce and help report on the diversity and other areas of the workforce in a way that can support policy making going forward. So anyone responsible for data on the line, one to watch in terms of a mandatory now, wasn't mandatory, hasn't been mandatory to date, perhaps part of the issue with it being patchy data, but if it is mandatory, then that obviously has resourcing implications for your institutions and so on as well, so something to keep an eye on, and maybe if it's an area of interest of yours to maybe get involved in developing, as I'm sure the government will be looking to pilot things hopefully before they fully roll them out. And then just as I bring in now Graham Hastings-Evans from NOCN, I'll leave on screen for a few moments here. This is just a little timeline more generally of some of the policies, just to give you a feel for what's expected in the spring of 2021 that we still haven't got. So any time now, and some of the things that I've not really talked about in terms of qualification reform, which will take quite a bit longer and won't be fully introduced, if introduced as per the plan here, until 2025. So that's my little kind of intro to the white paper, but more specifically chapter 5. Delighted to be joined by Graham. Thank you again, Graham and NOCN Group, for being our partner for these webcasts. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Graham, for 5 minutes or so for your thoughts. But just before I do that, to remind everyone, this is all being recorded. We'll send you the link, and the slides will be disappearing now, but they'll be sent to you as well, along with the recording. So, Graham, it is over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. I'm sure we'll all agree that outstanding teaching is critical if we're going to succeed. We need teachers, tutors that can deliver the digital world skills needed in the post-COVID economy. And hopefully at some point, somebody will realise that we need assessors and examiners as well. A bit worrying that's not mentioned, but perhaps it's just hidden in teaching somewhere. I think we all know the world's changed forever. During the periods of major conflict, adversity, such as the World Wars, the Gulf War, now the COVID pandemic, technology advancement speeds up. What would happen in a decade tends to happen in maybe a year. And we've all seen that over the last year, our own personal experiences. Who could have imagined in January 2020 that traditional classroom and workshop learning in schools and colleges would have moved online virtually overnight? That the two most common phrases we all know are, you're on mute, and is that a legacy hand? Now, some of this started obviously before COVID, but there's been a massive leap forward. All sectors, there's been a permanent structural change, and hence fundamental shift in the skills needed by people in the workplace. From our perspective in FE, the skills we need to be able to teach and also assess are different from those before COVID. Much greater emphasis on the new technologies such as drones, 3D immersive virtualization, if you even know what that is, and those sorts of fancy sounding things. You wouldn't think to give the keys of a jumbo jet to a trainee and saying, take this up and have a go. Well, some people might, I don't know, but not a good idea. But in some areas of our economy, construction and engineering manufacturing, we sort of do that. So for some of the occupations, we will see a move away from traditional approaches to certainly the early stages of learning through to the use of simulators, as has happened in aviation for years. For all occupations, there's also going to be a greening of skills. It's a new phrase for us all, in the way that things are done, new materials, new technologies, and all of those type of things. So in order to train people, our youngsters and the adults in the workforce, on these new technologies and simulators and greater, we need teachers and assessors to also be trained. They must be confident in the delivery of learning and assessment of these new activities, new ways of doing things. Accordingly, we've got to invest in our existing teachers, tutors and assessors, and to be able to recruit the new skills and experiences that we need. In that respect, I welcome the proposals around the national recruitment campaign in principle, but it must dovetail with and be complementary to what's happening in the local colleges, the local area. And we clearly need to address the imbalance of the BAME number of BAME teachers. Developing teacher training has got to be welcome, as is high quality professional development. The devil, as always, will be in the detail. Another important statement in the white paper is there should be clear routes for industrial professionals to move into teaching. These are the people presumably really do have these new skills out there in the economy, and for existing staff to be seconded into industry, again to increase their technical skills. We've got to think that's a good idea, but I'm concerned how successful this approach will be if we don't address in certain sectors the issue of pay differences, which Nick has mentioned. In some sectors, particularly STEM and say financial services, people in industry are earning significantly more than teachers. I mean, of the order of 50% in some cases. So will people really move down into teaching? And if we send our really able teachers to industry on work placements, will they come back? I suppose the issue of pay, and hence the means of paying the pay, has not been addressed yet, and it does need to be. It needs to be looked at, because it could be the thing that stops all these wonderful ideas happening. So a lot of ideas need to be fleshed out in consultation, so we get some real practical and realistic approaches coming out of this. And as I've mentioned before, I think that needs to include assessors, examiners and mentors into this. It's the whole of the FE workforce that we need to invest in, not purely just the teaching staff. Now, this is the last week of the 6-week series, and I hope people who've stuck with it this long, and I know thousands have, I hope you found it useful and stimulating. I certainly have, and it's made me think a lot, reading the page and starting to try and say things to you every week. It's made me think about it all. We must welcome the white paper, but we do need a lot more detail and evidence around the proposals, some of which are a bit contradictory, and I am hopeful over time we will get that ironed out. I'm sure we've all got 3 main points that we've drawn out of the white paper. For some, it'll be streamlining funding or higher technical skills or college governance. Mine are a bit different. Firstly, my point is, how will employers be engaged, as this is such a key reason for the proposals, and it runs, as Nick has said, right the way through the white paper. And for some of us that's been around for a long time, we'll remember we used to have 9 regional development agencies that did this, and somebody decided to ditch them because it was deemed they didn't work. So are we truly convinced that something of the order of 50 mini little RDAs will produce better local skills improvement plans? It's a question. And how does all this fit in with the structure of local governance and economic development, which comes under the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government? So, I'd like to better understand how the government departments are joining up, and that brings me to my second point, and that's the link to BA's industrial strategies and embedding these in occupational standards and hence the local skill improvement plans. I've got major concerns about how that will happen. People talk about it's what the employer wants. I've done a lot of employee engagement over the years. You get 100 employers in a room, you get 100 different views. So which employer are you listening to? So interesting dilemma. And lastly, of my 3 points, it's ensuring we secure the support for the level 2 workforce, which is the backbone for certain sectors. And I really understand the desire to move a great proportion of the workforce up the skills ladder to level 3 and above. I believe the implied silver bullet running behind, through all of this of 100% of the workforce being at level 3 and above is hopelessly unrealistic. And in my experience, adopting an unachievable objective inevitably leads to disaster. Things don't work. What we all need to do now, I think, is to engage with the consultations that are planned for the white paper. I think there's a great opportunity here to make a real difference, and we should grab this with both hands to help turn this white paper, with all its warts and gaps, into something that's really great for the sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. I certainly echo your plea there to the sector and the point about us doing these webcasts. It's absolutely to engage, encourage, enthuse. There is a lot of new money being put into further education. The profile of the sector is definitely rising across government, and I think that's a testament to the department and to the Secretary of State in getting this white paper out. But as always, devil will be in the detail, and the more that we can engage in the process of developing that detail, I think the better. Especially, I'm certainly not at the coalface, but I think certainly those that are at the coalface, and particularly around the teaching side of things, will want to do so. So let's try and do a bit of that now. David Russell is, of course, the Chief Executive for the Education Training Foundation and is joining us on the line now. David, you're obviously at the heart of a lot of the implementation around the teaching policies as far as recruitment, retention and CPD is concerned. Let's just start though, if we may, David, as we have on previous weeks, with just an opportunity, please, for you to give us kind of 5 minutes or so around your thoughts on the white paper or anything else. And I'll let you do some more introductions if that's okay as well, as far as the ETS is concerned. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. I thought your kind of unpacking of the chapter was really great. It was really clear, and thank you for doing that. And I also thought I was really interested where Graham started with his comments, because one of the interesting things about this white paper is you wouldn't know it was written during a pandemic. And Graham put that into context really well. And I'm going to pick up that theme if I can. I mean, the pandemic's not over, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it does feel like we're entering a period of recovery, and that'll be a period of recovery that will last a lot longer than the pandemic in many ways. Period of economic recovery, of educational recovery, but also sort of social and psychological recovery. And I think the education system is going to be really key to that recovery. And I think the further education system in particular is going to be central to economic and social recovery. So that comes on top of the big underlying trends, which again, kind of Graham pointed to quite rightly in my view: automation, how that's changing the world of work, and climate change and all the challenges that brings as well. And then, as if it wasn't complicated enough, just kind of throw in Brexit as well, and all the challenges and the changes that brings as well. So we need a strong, flexible further education system to cope with all of that, to lead that recovery process. And for me, a strong, flexible further education system is one that's outstanding at what it does. And what it does is teaching and training. That's what the Education and Training Foundation is here for. That's why I do the job I do, because having worked in government for 16 years, I came to the personal conclusion that an awful lot of what government does to try and improve the quality of the education system is quite peripheral. It spends a lot of time talking about funding, qualifications, structures, accountability, and hardly any time thinking about what is taught, how well is it taught, and who is it taught to. These are the things that really make the most difference. And that's why this chapter of this white paper is so kind of interesting and energizing, because it's actually going right into that territory and talking about outstanding teaching. So that's fantastic. In the ETF's view, what you need for outstanding teaching and training, well, lots of things, but you could summarize it like this. You need three things. You need people who are skilled, knowledgeable, and motivated. You need them to be well led and well managed, and you need them to be well equipped. I mean, you can describe it in other ways, but that just about covers it, those three things. And this chapter is really all about the first one, and getting people who are skilled, knowledgeable, and motivated. In order to do that, I think you need four things. I think you need the right recruitment, you need the right training, you need the right development, and you need the right recognition and reward. And as you set out very clearly, the chapter deals with three of those four. It deals with recruitment, deals with training, deals with development, and it doesn't deal with recognition and reward. And this is a really big problem. It's not a case that 3 out of 4 is not bad. The glass is 3/4 full. It's not. That's not the right analogy for me. It's more like a chair with 3 legs. It's pretty hard to sit on a chair with 3 legs. You could just about do it, but you got to sit right at the edge, really tense, so you don't fall over. And that feels like quite a good analogy for me, what it's like teaching in the FE sector right now. You're perched on the edge and you're really tense and you might fall over. So this is a massive gap, and the government knows this, the department knows this, and it has to be returned to, or because otherwise those three legs won't create a stable system. But coming back to the good things that are in it, you know, in terms of recruitment, recruitment from industry, yes, absolutely. And the Taking Teaching Further program that the ETF runs has been really successful. But it's interesting, I just want to kind of emphasize, it's not just a recruitment program. We did some research, ETF did some research with SEMTA a few years ago, specifically into vacancies in STEM subjects mainly. And we found that, you know, yes, there is a recruitment problem from time to time, but at least as important as a retention problem. So you get people kind of cycling in and out of teaching in STEM subjects. People come in for a career change, find it very challenging, and cycle out again. And there are lots of reasons for that the research points to. I mean, one Graham already pointed to, which is people generally take a pay cut, and sometimes people just find that it's not sustainable. But also, it's very challenging starting a new profession. Teaching is hard. And often these are people who are kind of mid-career or past mid-career and having to start again at the bottom of a new profession. It's very kind of psychologically challenging, emotionally challenging as well. And our sector is not great at induction. You know, we do tend to throw people in. The UK education system has one of the smallest proportions of non-contact time of any OECD country. We're pretty full on with what we demand of our teachers in terms of phase time. So very challenging, and you get people circling out again. So the Taking Teaching Further program does help colleges and providers recruit to hard to fill vacancies, but it also provides good quality initial teacher education. It also pays for timetable remission. It also arranges mentoring and links people into professional networks and all of that. And that's key for recruitment, retention, onboarding, development, and securing someone in the profession. So that's recruitment. Initial teacher education, I was really interested in your take on it. I mean, I don't get any sense that the government is interested in a return to regulation and saying, you know, this is the qualification that everybody must have in order to teach an FE. I don't think they're up for that, really. I think instead they're very focused on the quality of provision, and you know, as the white paper says, the quality of provision in initial teacher education is quite patchy. And generally speaking, the bits that Ofsted inspects are very good or better, but there's a lot of other initial teacher education which is very deregulated. You're relying a lot on the quality of providers who are providing qualifications at level 3, 4, 5, and you know, these are quite lightly regulated. So a focus on quality. I think there should also be a focus on level, and I think there should also be a focus on subject specificity, because evidence tells us that high quality training and development has a very strong subject specific element. So that's the training bit. Then the development bit is huge actually, and it's not just about CPD. It's also about career pathways. You know, we don't have clear career pathways in further education. We don't even have sort of agreed terminology or kind of widely recognized professional statuses. So having rebuilding those career pathways and having recognized professional status, really, really important. And at the heart of all that is having a strong professional membership body. It's a real Achilles heel of the further education system that we don't yet have kind of strong, not necessarily mandated. And you're talking about your wife, you know, I don't think we'll move back to a sort of IFL type scenario where you have to join a body and you have to register your CPD. And actually, I wouldn't be in support of that anyway. But a very strong custom and practice of belonging to your professional membership body, you know, will move us to a better place when we move there. And then linked to all of that, diversifying the FE professional workforce. I mean, you quoted some figures from the white paper. I give you a different figure drawn from the SIR, and I take your point about the SIR data not being as good as it could be. But according to that, about 85% of the FE teaching workforce is white British. Whereas if you look at SET membership, so the Society for Education and Training, the professional membership body the ETF runs, only 74% are white British. So we feel really pleased that we're creating a diverse membership body, and I think that needs to be a sign of things to come. And then the last thing I want to say is I think there's a bigger game underneath all this, because although there's some great stuff in the white paper, and especially in chapter 5, it is still about government intervening, it is still about government trying to fix, trying to improve. And we'll never get off this treadmill of repeated government intervention unless one of two things happens. Either on the one hand, government just loses interest completely in FE, that would be terrible. But the other way we could go is if FE becomes a self-improving system that has the strength and the capacity to be self-correcting and self-improving. And that's a really exciting future, I think, that we should be moving towards. And we could talk for ages about what that would take, but in summary, I think what we would need for that is we need a strong professional body that the vast majority of people are a part of. We need a collegiate developmental ethos from the leaders and the teachers in the system. We need agreed professional standards that are universal and universally adhered to, and we need an innovative mindset that tries new things, well evidenced things, not crazy things, but tries new things, and then captures that innovation and feeds it back into the system for the benefit of the whole profession. And I think actually this white paper is still a long way away from imagining that self-improving system, but I definitely think it's putting in place some of the things that will move us in the right direction.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting and really useful to get your take on the key aspects around teacher recruitment, retention, and so on. Let's just start, if we may, David. We'll just have a little conversation, pick up on a few points. I do want to get on to pay and that fourth missing chair leg, as you've described it, and how that might play out. But let's just start with something that you referred to at the end there, which is a sort of self-improving sector. You refer to there need to be agreed professional standards that are universally adhered to. Are you describing something that is universally voluntary? Is that an oxymoron? How would you, before we talk about what that standard might be, how would if you were still in the department writing the policies, how would you make it universally adhered to?
Well, it's a great question, and as I said, I tend to think that mandation is not the way to go, or rather, it's not the way to go from where we are. So it really depends where you're starting from, the effect of regulation or deregulation. So I'll give you an example. When the academy program came in schools in a big way towards the end of the Blair government and the start of the coalition government, there was a lot of anxiety about the fact that, in effect, school teaching was being deregulated in terms of its qualification, because you no longer had to have QTS to teach in a school. And there was a real concern that there'd be lots of unqualified teachers. And after a few years of this de facto deregulation, the percentage of teachers who were properly qualified had slumped from 96% before deregulation to 95% after deregulation, and it had stopped moving. Why? Because there's such a strong custom and practice in school teaching that you were expected to have QTS and everything that goes with it in terms of initial teacher education. In FE, we're in a completely different place. I mean, roughly a third of teachers are qualified at level 5 in teaching qualification in our sector. Roughly a third are qualified at level 6 or above, and roughly a third are qualified below level 5 or not qualified at all. Talking about teaching qualification, not subject qualification. If that's your starting point, trying to mandate a level of qualification is a very, very uphill struggle, and New Labour government tried it with, in a way, with QTLS, and we had Lingfield and all of that afterwards. Was seen not to have worked. Whether they could have pressed on with it and taken 10 years is another question. And your question about mandating professional standards is all part of that same thing. So we have professional standards in FE. The ETF created them in consultation with the sector. They exist. They're very widely used, but they're not used by everyone. They're used by kind of 80–85% of teachers in the sector, not 100%. They're used by Ofsted when they look at initial teacher education, but they're not used by Ofsted when they inspect FE. So again, not universal in application. And mandation, it is a very, very blunt instrument. I think the way to go rather is, as I say, through the strength of a membership body that has these professional standards at its heart, and people sign up to them as part of them.
I mean, if you consider how different our sector is in other ways, in the way it competes across organisations, there'll be a college competing with another college, or there'll be an independent training provider competing with another independent training provider, or there'll be two independent training providers competing with each other. It's a very, or as in the white paper's own words, a very crowded provider base. The government are talking about registers in the form of, say, apprenticeships, and setting certain standards to be on that register. I mean, that would obviously be a mandation of sorts, because if you're not on the register, you can't access the public subsidy. How realistic, from our starting point, is it to try and achieve something universal without mandation? It's not realistic, is it? It would have to be mandated, would be my feeling.
Well, your question assumes that mandation would be effective, and that's what I'm questioning back. I don't think it would be. I think the question is, it
wouldn't be effective because there wouldn't be enough. It would destroy the recruitment strategy. Why would it not be effective?
Because of my point about where you're starting from in terms of current custom and practice. So any mandation, I think, would have to have an implementation plan that had a very long lead-in time, had staging posts along the way, would mitigate all the negative effects that you pointed to in terms of, whenever you raise a bar, there's risks in terms of, making it less attractive, more difficult, squeezing some people out, creating hoops that people have to jump through, and then there's always a difficult trade-off, as there was with QTLS originally. If you make it really difficult, you lose lots of teachers. If you make it really easy, what's the point? Because everybody just passes it as a paper exercise.
Yeah.
I mean, when the ETF took on QTLS, that's why we completely overhauled it and made it a much more rigorous process. So now it's a very challenging post-qualifying process, which people are rightly proud of when they succeed. Wasn't quite where we found it, but I guess it's just that the realism of the policy-making process means you have to have a very long developmental thing, which in the end doesn't look that different to non-mandatory.
So what I mean, whether it was going to be mandatory or kind of voluntary to have this benchmark, where do you see it being set? I mean, I remember debates, arguments, probably around the time you're describing, sort of 8–9 years ago, with free schools and whether the teachers need to be qualified or not. And we were talking then about whether a teacher in any subject should be qualified. I say qualified, should be certificated at level 2 in English and maths as a minimum, for example. Was that, I mean, excuse my ignorance, was that ever implemented? Could anyone teach technically without a qualification in anything, including English and maths, or was that ever implemented? I probably should know this.
There's absolutely no regulation stipulating what qualifications you need in order to take any teaching or training role in further education.
So let's start then with English and maths. Would that be a reasonable minimum as a starting point that every teacher should have level 2 in English and maths, if that's something that we're expecting all our 16 to 18-year-olds to have. Should we expect the teachers as a minimum to, I mean, forget talking about level 5 and 6 for a moment as far as a teaching qualification. What about English and maths?
Oh, absolutely. And you can't achieve QTLS if you don't have level 2 English and maths. Absolutely, that's an easy one for me. But the bigger answer to your question would be, you know, it's not for me or you or anyone else to kind of randomly say where the line should be drawn. The profession itself should set its own standards, and it needs to have a vehicle, a mechanism for doing that. And in any other profession, the mechanism or the vehicle would be the professional body.
Sure, but I mean, professional bodies made up of human beings, individuals, and you know, someone would have to take a lead to get that agreed, and then the government would presumably have to sign that off. So, you know, let's put yourself in that position just for a moment. If you were to be, you know, drafting the final version of this code, as it were, for the professional body, what you must have thought about this over many years. What's not too low but not too high? So what's the right balance between it being, you know, just a paper exercise and it meaning that, you know, a third of the current teaching workforce would rethink their ability to continue in the profession? Roughly what sort of level are we? Can we talk in those simplistic terms? Is it level 5? Is it level 6? Is it how does that work?
Well, the conversation is the important thing. So getting the debate across the profession really matters, because the question you're asking is great, but you want an answer. I'll give you my answer for what it's worth. Yeah. My answer is that the FE teaching profession is very, very diverse, and you can't impose a schools built system on the FE, and that's what you would be doing if you identified one qualification or one level. In fact, you know, we have a very wide range of professional and paraprofessional roles. I mean, the armed services, for example, typically choose level 4 as the appropriate level of qualification for their trainers. They've thought about that very hard, and I'm not sure it would be sensible for anyone else to second guess them on that. Graham mentioned assessors and you know, the qualifications that are relevant to assessment. That's a whole other area. For me, the really important thing is to have career pathways, ladders of progression. There are different levels of qualification that are appropriate for different roles, and that will depend on the level of qualification you're teaching. It'll also depend on the context. It'll depend on the height and the breadth and so on. So for me, the thing that's missing is not a single standard that everyone should have to accord to. The thing that's missing is career pathways that set out these different stages that one advances through. And to link it back to your point about pay, to link that back into some structure of pay as well. I think a blanket pay across the board is an issue. You know, I think it's just uncontroversial that FE teachers are underpaid as a whole.
Yeah.
But Treasury, as you know very well, finds it very difficult to just award general pay rises because they think it's dead weight. So the other thing we really need is high status roles at advanced teacher.
So we'll definitely come on to pay, and it's a great segue talking about kind of one of the incentives to get qualified or to increase your qualification level is obviously the remuneration that one would hope would follow, and the responsibilities as well that come with that. Before we do that, just a point from Safia, just coming back to my English and maths point as you know, if you will, as a starting point. So Safia says, when I went into teaching in 2000, the first thing I was asked to do was to sit my exams to GCSE levels, as I had the CSE passes, and the teacher training qualification would accept nothing less if they said the CSEs were out of date. Whilst you're saying, you know, it's not right across all professions to sort of mandate the same thing, and there need to be relevant pathways. I think you are saying though that you do think the government should, as a minimum, require English and maths, regardless of the teaching career pathways. Is that fair to say?
No, I didn't say a government should mandate it. I said every teacher should have it. It's not the same.
But but it's okay for a college or training provider to employ someone and without it and not require them to study for it and achieve it, though.
Not in my view. It's not okay. No, I don't think they should.
But the policymakers shouldn't make them. The point I'm trying to lead us into, which is why it's relevant to pay, is to come back to my earlier point. We all compete, and it's not an easy thing to do. But setting aside the quality of teaching for a moment, separating that out from the certification level, if you can pay less, you can charge less, and it can make you more competitive against, So we hear all the time about colleges competing with training providers, and whether colleges are able to pay what the training providers are able to pay, vice versa, or colleges playing with schools, and whether they're able to pay what schools are able to pay. And if you're a college, you could perhaps pay less by not requiring these qualifications, or a training provider could perhaps equally pay less. So that can help with recruitment, but you have what I might argue, fairly underqualified staff. So it might be the right thing to qualify your staff, but can you afford to? So by mandating some of these things, would it not put more pressure on government to financially invest in these institutions, in these further education skills institutions? Otherwise, they may continue doing it on the cheap, to put it in kind of blunt terms.
Yeah, I mean, your argument shows really powerfully why the current policy approach of competition creates a race to the bottom. Absolutely, you've just demonstrated that really clearly, and that's why the ETF focuses as strongly as we do on an alternative vision of collegiality, where a professional membership body sets the standards that people voluntarily adhere to. But you make a good case in a situation where competition has created a sort of low functioning equilibrium, if I can use that phrase. Sometimes you do need a temporary measure to break out of that low functioning equilibrium, and government mandation for a period is one possibility. Yeah, it's a good point.
Because I think we may see that. I mean, with regard to apprenticeships, we may see. So the government have tried to strip back the number of providers through introducing, in the last round of the register, some sort of more stringent requirements, not just on delivery volumes that you've actually done some apprenticeships, but on financial some kind of stability and history. And that's proven to have failed. That hasn't stopped providers with no financial history getting on the register, or simply buying someone that is on the register, as far as the organisation is concerned. And it seems to be they're looking now at other ways of kind of barring providers being able to be providers until they've got something, such as perhaps a qualified workforce. So it strikes me that mandation is probably going to come, at least in part of the sector, apprenticeships being the one that I'm talking about here. And I wonder whether, as a sector, we should get on that front foot, because the bar could be set too high if we don't engage in that mandation debate.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I agree with your analysis of what hasn't worked. I'm not quite reading it the same way as you, and I don't think we are very close to mandating standards, workforce standards in apprenticeships. I think there is a huge amount to be done between where we've been, which is trying to control quality through market entry and market exit, and on the other hand, mandating teacher quality and teacher qualification. There's actually a huge area in between where you just put in place some voluntary support on professional development, and there's been virtually none for the last few years. So the apprenticeships workforce development, for example, is a really welcome start, moving into that space and saying, well, how about we just make some investment in quality in this area first, and see how that goes. And it'd be very strange, in my view, if government jumped straight from the laissez-faire approach into the mandated approach.
I suppose
do that middle phase.
I suppose what the government have traditionally done, the department in particular, have traditionally done, perhaps rather than mandate, is the kind of carrot and stick approach, the kind of the bribe, if you will. So we perhaps, I mean, I'm just waxing lyrical now. Perhaps we'll see kind of, you can have capital funding if you do X, Y, or Z. You can have uplifts on the funding levels. We're coming on to funding now because I want to talk about pay. But I could potentially see situations where you could tender for the next round of traineeships if, and these kind of ways of not stopping you doing what you're currently doing, but if you want to play over here with boot camps, or you want to play over there with the level 3 offer and so on, then or in future with apprenticeships, I can you could see a means of almost creating a kind of 2-tier, not saying it's necessarily something that you want, but you could see almost a kind of 2-tier approach where you've got colleges who are very professional, just a stereotype, and they fairly highly unionized still, and then you've got the kind of the other part of the sector which kind of just is focused on the outcomes as far as the accountability regime is concerned, rather than so much on the inputs. Anyway, that was just thinking out loud a little bit. We'll have to wait and see exactly where the government go in this space. David, let's just talk about pay. I think the first thing from my perspective is it's important for the sector to understand that technically further education providers, including colleges, are not part of the public sector. And so whilst the government can say, we're going to put a percent or 2% or 3% extra into schools' budgets, and the schools need to pass that funding on to the pay slips, technically any extra money that goes into any further education provider, including colleges, even if the government say, please use this to pay the staff more, colleges don't have to do that. They have the freedom to spend their grant funding in any ways they see fit within the constraints of the law under which they're regulated. So how, if you're the government now, beyond just putting maybe this is the answer, beyond putting 5–10% on the base rates of further education funding, how do you get more money into the pay packets of teachers and lecturers?
It's a conundrum, isn't it? I'm not sure they know, and that's one reason why they haven't done it yet. And I also agree with you that you are right that a very good start would be an increase in the base rate. 5% doesn't even begin to cut it. 10%, you can start a conversation. Actually the deficit is much greater than that, as you know. But to try and answer the really difficult bit of your question, how does the government do this when it doesn't have the lever to oblige passporting? I mean, passporting through into pay. Well, the first thing I'd say is that in general, my experience is that FE institutions make the pay award that they can afford. So when pay is constrained, the vast majority of times, leaders and governors would make a bigger pay increase if it were affordable. So I'm not sure I'm not of that pessimistic camp that says pay won't be passported through. I think if funding is increased, then that will indeed feed through into pay. But I think we also need to be realistic that the Treasury hates blanket pay rises. They consider them to be dead weight, which is a phrase you'll be very familiar with, but maybe not everyone listening will be. So dead weight in Treasury terminology is when you pay more for something, but you don't get anything back in return. So giving everybody a pay rise, if everybody then just carries on doing the job they were previously doing, then in Treasury eyes, you've just wasted your money because you could have got what you had before without paying extra. So Treasury thinks of blanket pay rises as generally being dead weight. And this is why you get such extraordinary decisions like 1% for nurses. To most people, you just think, what on earth is going through anybody's head to think that 1% is a fair pay rise for nurses? And the answer is, well, they think more than that would be dead weight. So they've done a calculation that says nurses are going to put up with it and not going to leave. That's a very risky calculation, but that's what people in Treasury do. So the other thing you can do to try and get away from this dead weight problem is you can try and attach it to particular things. And that's where you were going with your earlier question about, well, how about we attach this financial incentive to this behaviour. I'm against that. I think that I think you never get off that treadmill if you're constantly attaching packets of money to particular outcomes. I think they're also, they skew people's behaviour, they create perverse incentives and so on. But what you can do possibly is create pay top-ups for people that have been through, that have demonstrated their excellence in particular ways. So for example, you could say anyone who achieves chartered teacher status, their employer can draw down some ring-fenced funding in order to top up their salary as a reward for having achieved advanced teacher status, which brings chartered teacher status. That's a perfectly sensible policy model and one thing that they could look at.
So, okay, so we've got the kind of carrot of a potential bonus, or I'm not sure whether I'm not sure how it might work in terms of a pay rise, because that's hardwired, isn't it, into the person's salary forever and more. But it could certainly be a bit like a bursary, a kind of one-off support with the training itself, some of which already happens, and then potentially with a cash incentive as well. What about differentials across sectors? I mean, we've got this challenge. A few people have been pointing out on the conversation here of certain industries, and I think Graham raised this as well. Certain industries where pay is particularly high because there's either a shortage or it's particularly skilled, or you need to be very highly qualified in that industry over many years before you can work in that industry. So then coming out of whenever you're coming out of the industry, you're coming out at a high level of pay. So in the education sector, as I understand it, we've traditionally not paid much attention to the course itself in terms of the sector it's in. You're a teacher and you've taught for X number of years, and that's the level of pay and experience you've got as a teacher. How much already goes on in terms of pay differential, and how much more should there be, and how easy is it to actually implement, particularly in a fairly unionized part of the sector like colleges?
Well, it varies a lot, doesn't it, from place to place, and some institutions stick very rigidly to pay bands, and others are more kind of flexible in terms of kind of adapting to the market demands, and that's a really uncomfortable thing about FE. You know, you said earlier, you know, it's not part of the public sector, and technically, of course, you're absolutely right, but you know, morally and psychologically, you know, many people who work in FE do feel like they're part of the public sector, and they're certainly public servants, and so you get this, I mean, delivering public benefit with public money, and for me, that's a pretty good definition of the public sector. So you get this very difficult tension where there aren't set pay bands, but there is an expectation that you treat people, you know, fairly and equitably, and I know that you know, colleges and other providers really grapple with this. My view is that it's impossible to expect to match industry salaries in most industries. It's just not a feasible proposition economically, financially, but it doesn't need to be, because very few people and no teachers make their career choice just based on pay. So you have to consider, you know, the whole package, and I don't just mean the whole financial package. I mean, obviously, you know, colleges generally have quite pretty attractive pensions, but I mean the whole experience, the reward, the recognition, the satisfaction, the status, you know, which is really important for me. You know, in some countries, if you're very successful in your industry, going to then teach other people to come into your industry is a very noble, high status thing that's respected not just by students and parents and other teachers, but is also respected by your colleagues in your industry. And it's not necessarily expected to be a one-way street. So this idea of cycling in and out, the ETF's done quite a lot of work with programs like Teach2 that establish long-term relationships between providers and employers and get those porous boundaries. This, for me, is the most fruitful way of getting more interchange between technical teaching and industry, and not forcing people to make this brutal choice. Okay, do you go for the rewards of teaching, the satisfaction and the emotional, psychological rewards of teaching, but sacrifice significant pay? Or actually, can you move between these two worlds and create more of a portfolio career? And that's quite commonplace in many other countries.
Do you think, I mean, a few people are commenting here on how, again, this is not an area of my expertise at all, but how teaching, particularly for those coming from industry, so they've had a kind of the minimum first career already, is actually hard. Not just in terms of doing it well, but in terms of the demands that your institutions will put upon you because of all of the, I'm sure rightly so, but all of the bureaucracy that surrounds more than just directional, training that you're delivering. All of the, the Ofsted frameworks, the administration associated with demonstrating all of the pedagogical techniques and strategies, and class sizes and workshops getting bigger to meet the demands of funding in the current climate and so on, and now introducing the whole digital aspect and where there might be a divide there. In the school sector, we've had a very, very active workload debate, and the unions have been very agitated. They've gone a bit quiet of late, but in the past sort of decade, very agitated about the workload demands on teachers. Now, one might argue that might be why they're paid a bit more if their workload really is that high, or might argue the unions aren't just as vocal, but it's the same problem in further education. If the government can't make pay, can't persuade the Treasury or the college leaders to put the pay up, whoever it happens to be, is there something that the government can do beyond the current strategies, and maybe we can finish on this question, can do to, as you've described it, or put it in my own words, kind of make the experience of being a teacher more enjoyable, more rewarding, in non-financial terms? Maybe we can end on a well-being. We've just published a supplement on well-being. FE Week have just published it. How can we, and maybe a part of this marketing recruitment strategy, can we encourage people out of industry for a really rewarding profession in further education and skills?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And to start with the first bit of your point about workload, yeah, absolutely. Workload is a big issue in FE, for sure. And you ask, why has it not had the same attention as it had in schools? I don't know the answer to that. It's a really important question. Your point about well-being is also very well made, and we know that it was already emerging as an issue prior to the pandemic. And we at the ETF and the Society for Education and Training have done a lot of work over the last year supporting members and supporting the wider profession with professional networks and with support materials and mechanisms and so on. So it's a really, really good point. But the really big point is the one about status and prestige, and making it an attractive profession to move into for people who are coming at it for the first time from elsewhere. And I think there's many aspects to this. One is getting people early, interestingly. So our program, Talent to Teach, which is actually about taking undergraduates or postgraduates and giving them a taste of the FE sector that they hadn't otherwise considered, has got some really encouraging results in terms of interesting people in a present or future career in FE. So getting people in early, opening up this kind of the secret garden of further education, which many people are unaware of. Everyone's unaware of until they become aware of it. And that might happen at the age of 16, or it might never happen. If you work in the Treasury. So getting people in early, really important. But also the positioning and the status, and this is my kind of most important thing that I want to end on. That the biggest thing the government could do to improve the status and the prestige of FE teaching is to talk a lot more about teaching, to talk a lot more about the process and the kind of the magic of teaching young people and adults to do new things, to discover new things, to empower themselves. Powerful knowledge applied. You know, it is just the most amazing, motivational, transformational thing. Talk less about structures, chambers, relationships, standards, funding routes, all of these things. It's never going to attract anybody to leave their job and go into FE, and instead talk a lot more about the amazing profession, which is working with young people and adults to change their lives. That's what people respond to. That's what people are looking for. That's what's going to be motivational, and also back it up with decent pay.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we will revisit the pay as we work towards potentially a 3-year budget, hopefully, because I think that's the time to do it. You can't really, I don't think, tackle pay as a one-off 1-year kind of solution. Then you're really kicking it into the long grass, aren't you, by doing that? So I'm sure we will revisit the pay issue, but the Department for Education, no doubt, would, at least privately, would direct us to the Treasury. So somehow we need to get the Treasury more involved, perhaps in our sector, and understanding the challenges at a more direct level, and overcoming that deadweight issue that you've rightly identified is prevalent as far as their policy considerations are concerned. So I'd like to thank you, Dave, very much for your time this morning. We are at time. Thank you very much to Graham Hastings-Evans as Chief Executive for NOCN Group and our webcast partner for the last 6 weeks. I am in breaking news. I am in some final discussions with Professor Alison Wolfe, who, alongside Keith Smith, is really the key architect, I think, behind this white paper. She's at number 10, has been for about a year, doing 4 days a week. I'm in talks with her about her joining us, perhaps for a 7th, maybe this time next week, we'll see, perhaps for a 7th webcast based on her availability. So that could be a bit of fun, almost doing a conclusions with her in the way we did a summary at the start with Keith. So that's something to look out for. We'll be sending you this recording along with the slides I've mentioned a few times now, but a few of you, as always, are still messaging saying, am I definitely getting the recording? How am I getting the recording? Where can I get it? I know how much you want to share this with many others, which is great to hear. Also, it's nice to get some comments from you on your way out. So as we finish the webcast now, if you haven't already used the questions box, please use it now, just to leave me a few little comments. Just to say, let me know if you found it useful. I like to screenshot that and include that in my Christmas bonus negotiations for how well or not things have gone, usually how well, hopefully, through the year. I've certainly very much enjoyed doing these webcasts these last 6 weeks, and I've been getting a lot of positive feedback. So it's something we're going to have a look at if we can do more of them. Graham, as our webcast partner, would you like to add anything to your final words?
I just hope people take away some positives to getting involved in the consultation. Yeah, and let's try and make this a success.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'll leave the webcast playing for a little bit longer if anyone wants to leave a little comment. But on that note, I'm going to say farewell. Get out if you can and enjoy some of the if not chilly, certainly sunny is here anyway. Sunny weather where you can. It still feels like the weekend to me. So I'm going to get outside and do a bit of gardening or something, and worry about work tomorrow. My day is done. Bye for now. Thanks again, David.
Bye.